Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Fireside Chat. Our program tonight is William Trent, Factor of Ambition with Jason Cherry. My name is Fran Dolan, and I'm the Director of Operations for the Library Company of Philadelphia, and we are very excited to have you with us tonight for this event. The Library Company of Philadelphia is an independent research library concentrating on American society and culture from the 17th through the 19th centuries. Free and open to the public, the Library Company houses an extensive non-circulating collection of rare books, manuscripts, broadsides, ephemera, prints, photographs, and works of art. We genuinely have a lot of stuff up in the stacks. It's really remarkable how much we have. Our mission is to foster scholarship in and increase public understanding of American history before 1900 by preserving and interpreting the valuable materials in our care. The Library Company connects with thousands of visitors annually, ensuring that the lessons of the past will continue to amaze, instruct, and inspire future generations. We serve a diverse constituency throughout Philadelphia and the nation, offering comprehensive reader services, an internationally renowned fellowship program, online catalogs, and regular exhibitions and public programs. I'd like to give a special thanks to Randall Miller for his generous support of the Fireside Chat program that allows the Library Company to continue to offer this for free to the public, which is very, very important to us. For more information about supporting the Library Company and to learn about our shareholding program, please visit our website at librarycompany.org. Following tonight's program, there will be a Q&A, and you can submit any questions to that throughout the program using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Tonight, we are joined by Jason Cherry. Jason A. Cherry is a 2002 graduate of the University of Massachusetts. An independent historian, Jason has reenacted the French and Indian War for over 30 years, portraying the group of volunteers hired under William Trent Jr. in 1754, a unit known as Captain William Trent's Company. He has also reenacted the Revolutionary War for over 30 years as well, portraying the German Regiment, a group that actually crossed the Delaware with General Washington's army on Christmas night and fought at the First and Second Battles of Trenton. Currently, he's the research consultant for the 1719 William Trent House in Trenton, New Jersey, and works as an assistant teacher for Stepping Stones Children's Center in Gibsonia, Pennsylvania. On March 13th, 2024, his new book and biography, William Trent, Factor of Ambition, was released and met with rave reviews from the CEO of the Heinz History Center, Andrew Masich, 2013 George Washington Book Prize winner Stephen Brumwell, and most recently by the Journal of the American Revolution. He lives in Butler, Pennsylvania with his wife, Emily, and his two beautiful daughters, Penny and Charlotte. Welcome, Jason. It is great to have you here this evening.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Take it away.
All right. Everyone, just give me a minute here and we will get started. All right. So yeah, I'm very excited to explain this tonight and talk about just a fascinating figure in William Trent for those of you that are either familiar or not familiar. Sort of give you a I could be here forever talking about William Trent, but give you an idea of basically how fascinating this basically important historical figure was of the 18th century. So we'll begin with this, the early life of the young William Trent. He was born in Trenton, New Jersey. If you're looking at that name and looking at obviously the surname of William Trent, you realize that this capital city of New Jersey that we know of today, it was actually named after Trent's father, who also named William, Judge William Trent, and that's his signature there. Judge William Trent eventually would move to West Jersey, being a shipping merchant in Philadelphia, and start a settlement basically on almost 1,000 acres there in the West Jersey district of the time. And would eventually, this would be named for this basically wealthy landowner and be called Trent's Town, eventually being shortened, by the mid 18th century being Trenton that we know today. And it would be at this time in Trenton, New Jersey, that this young William Trent Jr. Would basically be born either in March or April of 1722. and grow up basically the son of Judge William Trent and Mary Coddington. You can see her signature there, and that is basically his mother's signature at the young age of 13 years old at a Quaker wedding. She came from the Coddington family, well-educated family out of Newport, Rhode Island, and would eventually move to Philadelphia, and then eventually, where she would meet Judge William Trent. And so young William Trent, born in 1722, would eventually get arranged from his mother being a first cousin of Edward Shippen III, basically be apprenticed with him as a mercantile apprentice. Edward Shippen III being a very important merchant there in Philadelphia, and would also be the grandfather of Margaret Shippen. Eventually, she would marry Benedict Arnold, and we'd know, as Margaret or Peggy Shippen during the American Revolution. This Edward Shippen III would be who Trent would serve a matter of years learning the mercantile trade there in Philadelphia. And I let it be known, too, that, Edward Shippen III was a shareholder in the Library Company of Philadelphia. He was also a trustee and founding of the College of New Jersey, the future Princeton, in 1746. It would be under this mercantile apprenticeship, and where Trent would not only learn arithmetic and show his education, but it would be also with Edward Shippen and a group of gentlemen from Philadelphia that he would attend the very important Treaty of Lancaster in 1744. And as you can see here, this is the house that he would grow up in, or would actually be born in. That still stands today there in Trenton, New Jersey. This is the 1719 William Trent House that the family was living in by 1721. As it was completed in 1719, but they would move in there fully there by 1721. And the young William Trent would be born there, and basically until he would, achieve his mercantile apprenticeship there in basically in the late 1730s, would live in this house. And as you can see here, you can also see the signature and seal of Edward Shippen III, his basically master and merchant. This would also be a silhouette of the only known thing to exist of Edward Shippen III, and you can see sort of as a nice resemblance to Benjamin Franklin. But this silhouette here showed his basically character gently there as we move on. And this was also to show even the proof, because it was always known sort of circumstantially that William Trent served under Edward Shippen as an apprentice. But as you can see, this shows here in the hands of basically an account of my master, Edward Shippen. This was in 1742, and one of the earliest signatures working for Edward Shippen, William Trent would do there in Philadelphia. But moving on, as we get into the 1740s, I mentioned the Treaty of Lancaster. But his reputation would precede him. By 1746, being that he was sort of into the fur trade, not only at Edward Shippen's storehouse there in his founding settlement in the 1730s called Shippensburg, and the present day city that we know today, Trent would not only garner a reputation in the fur trade, but also being the middleman between the mercantiles and the fur traders. It would be then that he would be commissioned then a captain in King George's War. This was the sort of the precursor to the French and Indian, part of the War for Austrian Succession from 1744 to 1748 that happened mostly in New England and Canada. He would be commissioned then in an independent Pennsylvania company that was paid by His Majesty. But it would be at this present site. You see the Grossman furniture here, but this was at the corner of 2nd and Arch. This was a tavern then known in 1746 as St. George and the Dragon Inn, and this would be in the site of it. And at this site would be where Trent would recruit his men, in addition to being only a short distance and yell away from Christ Church of Philadelphia, where he would recruit most of his soldiers there, in 1746. But he would learn a lot, at least, this King's Commission, because by 1747, they would be stationed in New York, Albany, and then north to almost what was then Saratoga, New York, Schuylerville, New York. It would be there that he would survive an ambush. This picture here shows the present-day site of where he would survive an ambush and actually give an account where 6 of his men were actually scalped in front of him. He would lose a lot of supplies, but would survive and fight the men off there in basically the only skirmish that happened during their stationing and excitement during King George's War, in which he would be commended for his service in Pennsylvania by not only His Majesty, but also the Pennsylvania Assembly there by the end of 1747. But then as he get back into the fur trade, he would partner with George Crowan, his on and off again partner, known as King of the Traders. And they would basically get a third man, Richard Hockley, a protege of Thomas Penn, and who would have a dry goods store in Philadelphia. And then they would use this connections for not only receiving money from London and Thomas Penn when Trent would go there to London there in 1748, but also put their name and stamp. You see this HTC, this was Hockley, Trenton, Crowan. This was the trademark that was on all the barrels, all the supplies. And he would also put on his letters showcase. And there would be at one point by 1752, there was an Indian town around that didn't have this trademark or have the insignia or name of Hockley, Trenton, Crowan on this. So they were very popular at this time and probably one of the most influential mercantile firms of that early 1750s as it went. But unfortunately, by 1752, with the French sort of moving into the Ohio Valley, it played a role in not only financially, but also with everything going on with this business. And I mentioned too about him going to London in 1748. That wasn't the only thing he brought back. Unfortunately, he would bring back intermittent fever that we know today is malaria. Unfortunately, this would plague Trent almost for the rest of his life. He would not treat it perfectly, really good the first time he got it, until the end when it was almost too late. And by then, the illness was making him weaker and weaker, and he would have certain relapses over the course of his career, even up to his death in 1784. But eventually, then, by the time that hits the popularity of his mercantile firm, he would also serve as a district justice. He and George Crowan himself, being that they were newly residents of Cumberland County, Pennsylvania, that began in 1749, they would become district justices not only for their basically their residential standing, but also for financially, being that these men were pretty much gentlemen in Cumberland County, operating their basically interactions and transactions through the Ohio Valley. So this was a site of the basically for Widow Piper's Tavern, as you can see in the right-hand corner. This is the original desk and chair that was used by the district justices in 1750, where the first courthouse was before it eventually moved by late 1751, early 1752 to Carlisle. Because at one point, the Cumberland County seat and district seat at that point would be in Shippensburg, Pennsylvania. By the 1750s, he would also be elected in 1751 as a representative of the Pennsylvania Assembly in Pennsylvania, as being one of two men that would eventually arrive at the Pennsylvania State House there in Philadelphia. And if you're not familiar with the Pennsylvania State House is, that was Independence Hall. What we know today is Independence Hall. And this Pennsylvania Assembly would meet representatives, just for an example, would be from Philadelphia County, would be Benjamin Franklin, and several others, Isaac Norris of the Norristown named, and also a former partner of his father. But it would be at this time that they would basically vote. Their most important voting was have a cast iron bell from the Whitechapel Foundry in the East End of London. This would eventually arrive by 1752. And this basically State House bell, new State House bell, would be known as a Liberty Bell eventually. And it would be very important. It's sort of a fun fact to know when you're learning about William Trent. He was part of this, in addition, because of his reputation in the fur trade business and mercantile business, being a backcountry merchant. He was able to be a part of this. He would also purchase a tall case clock, have it made by John Wood Sr. of Philadelphia, well-known clockmaker. But then in November of 1752, being, like I said, his reputation of being a gentleman, being on the assembly in the fur trade, he would also become the factor, or basically account keeper, expedition organizer for one of the most powerful land agencies in the world, the Ohio Company, started by George Washington's older half brothers, Augustine and Lawrence Washington. And it would be just of Northern Neck shareholders in Virginia, but eventually spread to Maryland with Thomas Cressup and others who would garner shares. But it would be Trent that would basically, by the fall of 1752, become this, because of his penmanship, because of his account keeping, be this factor for the Ohio Company and be in charge of all this. And at this point, it would be basically he would view the Ohio Company wanted to expand in the Ohio Valley, and by doing so, they wanted to set their eyes basically in the Ohio Valley, where basically was the beating heart of the Ohio Valley, known as the Forks of the Ohio. The Forks of the Ohio was very important, not only for Virginia, but also the Ohio Company. And it would be on suggestion from the Indians, one of the main vocal leaders, the Half King or Tannerison, that they would try to build a fort there at the Forks of the Ohio. And if you're not familiar with the Forks of the Ohio is, It's the city of Pittsburgh today, where the Monongahela and the Allegheny meet to form the Ohio River. It would be at this point, you can see with the the fountain, the present day photo, that it would be at this point that Trent and the others would try to build, or at least attempt to build, an English outpost there in the spring of 1754. But unfortunately, the French would come down the river there in the spring by April of 1754. It would be Trent that would leave early in March to hopefully hurry up George Washington, who was also commissioned to help join him with soldiers to help guard these workmen as they built this fort. And as they were building sort of the structural and putting up defense entrenchments, it would be when the French would come down the river and force the men, because they weren't at war at that time in the spring of 1754, but would force those men eventually to abandon their outpost, to which the French would use that lumber, use those buildings that were still built there, and build their own by the fall of 1754 and name it Fort Duquesne. It would be because of this eviction lead to further on basically conflicts that would lead England and France to eventually start America's First World War. So this played a very big role in this. And eventually, being because of the French controlling the Ohio Valley, business was not good for Trent or Crone. So they would eventually draft an act of relief. It would be something that they would have with almost 15 signatures that they would give. Basically, Trent would write it, George Crone would sign it, and they would send it to His Majesty, the Privy Council there, to get drafted in 1755. That would give them a relief for almost 10 years. And this, as they would do this, they would be free of debt or what they were being traced from creditors. And this would keep Trent's hope alive here, as eventually another expedition would come. There was a failed one in 1755 under General Edward Braddock that eventually gained even more control for the French to unleash basically the Ohio Valley and unleash their native allies to attack the English settlements that were in the region. But by 1758, Trent again would have high hopes, especially for this expedition in the Western country, and it was under Brigadier General John Forbes, as you see this picture here. And they would start in Philadelphia and then work their way to the west there, working their way where Trent would join General Forbes and be known as the Assistant Superintendent of the Western District for Indian Affairs. He would serve under Abraham Bosworth and would handle basically the natives not only at Fort Loudon, where he would he would give them supplies, and what led to the Indians joining on. The Indians were ready to abandon Fort Loudon and basically cease their loyalty for the English. It was Trent that eventually would help ease the tensions and give them their supplies, and would be rewarded for this service by becoming the assistant superintendent. And it would be then that Trent would lead the natives joining the British Army as they would finally retake the abandoned Fort Duquesne after the French would head north, and would be to a point that the General Forbes would then, by November of 1758, rename Fort Duquesne Pittsburgh in his Scottish accent, and eventually become the present day we know today as Pittsburgh. And then by the 1760s, I said about Pittsburgh being formed. As Pittsburgh was being basically constructed as far as settlement, they needed a defense. So they were eventually building a large construction of a fort, and a fort that they would name after William Pitt the Elder, the former prime minister. And it would be at this time that Trent would eventually have a role, sort of as he would watch the building of this in 1759, meeting with the natives, the local nations there. But would also join with the Lancaster firm. His family at the time was living in town of Lancaster, and he would form up with 3 other merchants to open what was then the largest store at Fort Pitt by 1761 when it was opened. And he would be at this Fort Pitt. You can see the plan there. He would have 3 different residential areas in the lower town district of Fort Pitt. There would be an upper town and a lower town. The lower town would be closer to where the point was, closer to the Monongahela River side at this point. And it would be then as they would lay siege to this, and the Indians would fall with agreements during 1763, a couple years after they would do with this. Trent would refer to this as the Late Indian War. It would be because of his experience already being a previous captain, and like I mentioned, the King George's War, and then during the French and Indian War, with trying to build the first English outpost there in 1754, and then eventually joining General Forbes to retake the Forks of the Ohio. By then, he would become the garrison, basically commander of the garrison militia. and at that point would be the most military person that was there ahead of the militia there. And under this militia, his second in command would be Josiah Davenport. Josiah Davenport was the nephew of Benjamin Franklin, so it was sort of another sort of relation there to Benjamin Franklin. And by doing so, he would also add some questionable characters. He would recruit such men on his Fort Pitt militia, a roster that would be over 100 men at one point, where he would recruit such men as Simon Girty, who would basically have more of a reputation or nefarious reputation, supposedly during the American Revolution, for his loyalties of staying with the native nations during the American Revolution, and his brothers, the Girty brothers there, James, George, and Thomas. And then eventually James Smith, who was basically the head of the Black Boys Rebellion that sort of rebelled against the crown, trying to give supplies to the natives there in 1765. All type of questionable characters that served under Trent there at Fort Pitt. But it would also bring up also a controversial thing when the blankets from the smallpox hospitals, when the garrison would be basically under quarantine for smallpox, they would take some blankets and handkerchiefs and would unfortunately give them to the natives there in June of 1763. That would lead sort of a controversial, due to not only being that this was known, but Trent would keep the controversial entries in his journal during 1763 that would give the only evidence of this that happened. But it would be Josiah Davenport, believe it or not, that would be promoted because of this, mainly because he was inoculated against smallpox, and probably be the one that actually gifted the blanket and the handkerchiefs to the natives there in June of 1763. But then, as Trent the late Indian War would end there in the summer of 1763. 5 years later, his reputation of getting men paid and trying to get back the service that he lost during not only the French and Indian War, but also the late Indian War, Trent would eventually attend the Treaty of Stanwix. Let me just pull up a couple of these things here. That's also the upper right-hand corner is also a corner of the last known thing of the flag bastion of Fort Pitt. But on the lower hand corner is the treaty with the Indians, Fort Stanwix, and that is the original found in Philadelphia Historical Society of Pennsylvania, the original journal that Trent would keep, 116 pages worth of the Treaty of Stanwix, where he would write the minutes. His notorious reputation of being a secretary at all these main native councils and treaties. This was no different. This was the largest Indian treaty ever assembled, with almost close to 3,000 Indians in 1768, the fall. And it would be at this time that they would receive a cession of land from the Six Nations, basically to make up for the debts from the late Indian War in 1763. But there was only one problem with that. As they sort of signed this sort of treaty, as you could say, or a deal with these Six Nations, they still had to get approval from His Majesty to turn this land into basically a charter to hopefully, start a colony to get back this debt, to sell off this land in parcels or in settlements. And by that time, in order to get His Majesty to sign it, Trent would eventually become active attorney with another fellow Philadelphia merchant, Samuel Wharton, who would sail to London. And you can see right there, there's the advertisement. The Betsy, that was the ship that Trent would sail on there in the summer of 1769, that they would finally head from Thomas Clifford's Wharf the whole way to London. So then he could begin this policy of hopefully realizing this dream of achieving this charter. And as he headed in here, his first stop was at the house of Dr. Benjamin Franklin, who at that time had been living in London there on Craven Street in London, just off their main drag called the Strand, just basically northeast of Charing Cross. And he would meet then, and in this basically guest parlor here, you can see it right here with Benjamin Franklin. And he would sit there and talk on what they needed to approach Parliament and the Privy Council with in order to gain this approval from His Majesty. And meeting with Dr. Franklin, he would basically take most of the notes. Dr. Franklin and Samuel Wharton, I mentioned earlier, would be the two gentlemen that would approach the Privy Council at least right away. And as he was keeping notes and doing his secretarial duties for Dr. Franklin over in London in the early 1769, early 1770s, he would stay along this present day street I just show you here. This is Villard Street. Then where it would be about a block or alley almost over from the Craven Street house where Dr. Franklin was. So they were always in touch and spending either dinner where sometimes they had salted fish and brandy, according to letters. But they would meet with Wharton the London postmaster Anthony Todd and Dr. Franklin. But then he would live then on what was then New Suffolk Street, but also known as Nassau Street today. Would be later on, him and Samuel Wharton would be close to that street. And they would then meet as the hostilities sort of happened in the colonies on the other side of the water there, the American colonies. Trent and Wharton and Franklin were basically meeting in secret at what was known then as the Crown and Anchor Tavern, because they didn't want anybody to know their business over here. People knew what they were discussing, but basically didn't know specifically, especially their plan to hopefully form a Grand Ohio Company. They met at this place here. You can sort of see the bottom right-hand corner. There's sort of an anchor on the wooden hand sign there. And they met at the Crown and Anchor Tavern. They would meet with several members, and even English members, former members of Parliament and current members of Parliament. One such was Thomas Walpole, a former banker. And they would be basically form this Grand Ohio Company where it would be American counterparts and English counterparts, Franklin included. It's which Trent would keep all the notes and write copies of letters, spending here by 1772, hopefully to approach the Privy Council, showing what their goal was. And it would be at this point, and this is the modern day showing of what I just showed you. I'll go back real quick just to show you. That was the sketch of the Crown and Anchor Tavern with the St. Clement Danes Church. And this today is the current, you can see the St. Clement Danes Church behind those trees there. And right at the corner here is where that would have Crown and Anchor Tavern would have been as they would meet. And they would basically decide with London, and it would be with the Board of Trade, that they would suggest a large colony, almost 20 million acres. They were looking at possibly 1 million or 2 acres, but at one point they wanted 20 million acres, of which they originally named it Pennsylvania in honor of William Pitt. And you get an idea of what this would have been. Originally, when they came, you see Indiana on there. That was the original name, at least on paper, of their original, what they planned for their land from the Six Nations, from the Treaty of Stanwix. But eventually they expanded what would present day be what was known as Vandalia. And that would have been the entire, as you can see, sort of the border of Kentucky, present day West Virginia. And they would have had, like I said, would have been way bigger than what the Indiana, or what their original proposal was, according to this. But it gives you an idea of when they were pursuing there by 1773. So at this point, by 1773, they're proposed of 20 million acres. Trent realized he had to address the basically Court of St. James, or His Majesty's Court. He had to head to and get basically the same what Benjamin Franklin and Samuel Wharton had. And that was hopefully gets a court suit made, basically a three-piece suit of a vest, breeches, and a coat, just like he had described earlier in letters, referring to Samuel Wharton and Benjamin Franklin wearing their finest silks. So in Spitalfields, the east end of London on Fournier Street, one of such of silk weavers, this is where Trent would have it basically laid out and tried on before they would eventually reach the London tailors there, probably in Westminster. So at this point, he had a court suit made by French silk weavers. And as you can see, this is part of the suit. I said there were 3 pieces. This is the only remaining suit. This is dated from what they believe is about, mid 1770s. This relies at the 1719 William Trent House. And this was this was the waistcoat or vest that he would wear under his court suit for the Privy Council when him and Samuel Wharton and Thomas Walpole and Benjamin Franklin would approach basically go down Whitehall and approach the Privy Council at the Court of St. James, which at that point was at the cockpit. As you can see, that's that middle building that just appeared here. And it was an octagonal shaped thing. It used to be was the last surviving building of Henry VIII's Whitehall Palace. And it would be basically where he previously had cockfights and different things, men's methods of gambling. But they would use this now as the Court of St. James and His Majesty's Court. And this would be where Trent and Franklin and Wharton would present their proposed colony at that time. That was approved. They eventually would, in July of 1772, get this approved. It would make the papers not even a week later, in the Oxford paper, basically achieving, fantastic goal of these counterparts of chartering a massive 20 million acre grant. But it had to be passed along to the Solicitor General, Alexander Wedderburn, that he would finally get his approval. And by doing that, they could have final approval. But as they did this and get sort of in the probationary status, by 1773, they had other members join, Matthew Featherstone very wealthy, deep pockets merchant that would also join and buy shares in this basically Grand Ohio Company, as would Edward Bancroft, a big counterpart of Benjamin Franklin. He would also be the future spy. For those of you familiar with Bancroft or even the Franklin series with Michael Douglas, Edward Bancroft, they would find out about 100 years after his death, he had secret letters. He was actually a double agent by 1777, handling intelligence not only for the British, but from whatever he recorded or used his being secretary, as basically as the right-hand man of Benjamin Franklin in Paris, France there. So, but at this time, it would be then by 1773, they wanted really to gain members. So by Pennsylvania, they would eventually join and call it Vandalia. Now you see this painting that came up, or a sketch that and portrait that came up. Matthew Featherstone would actually build a tower on his property there in Sussex. He would call it Vandalia Tower, and that's basically one of the towers today. It still resides today, but that was one of the ruins basically of this tower, and it would be considered a folly after with the outbreak of the American Revolution and the basically falter of this company called Vandalia. And I guess the biggest thing is where would the capital be of this massive 20 million acre tract? And it would be decided it would be in Pittsburgh, and it would be Trent that would suggest this because he figured Philadelphia and Williamsburg was too far to travel 400 and 500 miles, the extent to a capital that wasn't even in this Vandalia district, basically district or colony. So by Pittsburgh could be at the top of this colony, and then it would be suggested who would be proposed governor of this. And you see this blueprints right here. This would be Samuel Wharton's handwriting. This would be blueprints of his governor's mansion that he was feeling very confident with by 1773. Although it wasn't fully named, it was considered he or George Mercer, another shareholder and former member of the Ohio Company. Both were considered as proposed governors at this point. And it would be at this point that it would be Wharton that they thought would be the proposed full point that he would have this proposal and blueprint of his mansion, even send Trent to get garden seeds to take back to the colonies there. And it was very wishful thinking at the time. As you can see here, this is as they had done the change there in 1773, saying that this is in honor of Vandalia, in honor of Queen Elizabeth, because she descended supposedly from the Vandalic tribes in northern Africa and southern Europe. And it was changed then from Pennsylvania to Vandalia. So by 1770s, he would return back, and it would be in 1775. Now it's funny, Trent originally thought he would be gone for 5 months in 1769, and we realized he didn't return till the summer of 1775, so almost 6 years. And by doing so, Benjamin Franklin would actually return before he would, about a month or two ahead, where Franklin would join the Second Continental Congress and be a part of that. And by doing so, Trent would leave and stop one more stop before he would return back to the colonies. And he would arrive back in Philadelphia, but he would also not before smuggling some papers for Dr. Franklin. He would smuggle a letter because we have to realize at this time it was very dangerous to have any type of letters with supposed treasonous things towards the king or what could be misconstrued as treasonous things for the king. So at this point, Trent would take this. This would be the restraining acts, and it had been just announced in London and not officially intact and not even announced in the colonies yet. The mail and parcel ships had not sailed. And at this point, Trent would arrive and hand the restraining acts basically about a month or two even before they were officially announced or got to arrive in Philadelphia at this time. And this gives you an example. And what they did was basically restrain Pennsylvania, New Jersey, all the remaining that wasn't New England from their outside trade with Great Britain. And at that time, they were still waiting on the Solicitor General to basically approve the final approval of Vandalia. And it would be by that point, right at the outbreak of the Revolution, and basically as they were trying to get Vandalia approved, you can see another written as they were calling it the colony of Vandalia. They would get final approval from the Solicitor General, not under the impression that it would be shelved until hostilities in the colonies ceased. And what I mean by that is basically the outbreak of Lexington and Concord, as of which Trent had no idea that even outbreak that they did, in fact, see the Cerberus, a British warship, with basically Burgoyne, Howe, and Clinton sailing. As he sailed out, he would witness this in a letter and realize that they were sailing for Boston. So he knew something was up, but not sure what kind of hostilities were taking place, and would realize as he would arrive back in Philadelphia there in June of 1775, about a week or two before the Battle of Breed's Hill, or what we know today as Bunker Hill, that the American Revolution was beginning at this point. And as Trent would eventually recede back, he would finally get a plantation there in 1775, only a mile or two from his birthplace there in Trentstown, or Trenton. And it would be at this point, you can see this survey here. This is a survey of his land in 1777. He was actually leasing it from Elijah Bond, who owned the ferry there. And it would be at this time, these almost 700 acres that he owned. He owned 570. You can see the house that he lived on there, right on the Delaware River. But he also had options to run a ferry known then would be as the Lower Ferry, but eventually nicknamed the Continental Ferry, because during this time, during the American Revolution, he would offer basically a discount on the ferry to any active Continental Army soldiers, sort of the first military discount of its kind, meaning that there were 8 or 9 ferries, north and south of where he did this across the Delaware. It provided something that soldiers would take advantage of during this. And it would be at this time even too, and we look at that date of 1775 and 1776, that when Washington would cross the Delaware there on Christmas night, there in 1776, and it would be at this time that after the Battle of Trenton, some of the Hessians would flee south to Bordentown. It would be at this time they would flee from Trenton. Trenton would be, you see that arrow there, come down and then eventually go across the Crosswicks Road, which was right on Trent's property. So he was at home at the time, probably during this battle. You could probably hear the artillery, the musket fire, and then also seeing the Hessian soldiers going down the Crosswicks Road to Bordentown, passing over his land. And I mentioned how he operated that Continental Ferry and that discount. These are a couple of the gentlemen that actually crossed at this time in 1777. General Daniel Morgan and his Morgan's Rifles would cross there in the fall of 1777, fresh off their victory at Saratoga against basically the nicknamed gentleman Johnny Burgoyne, who posthumously would be named that. And would General John Burgoyne would surrender basically his Northern Army of the British. It would be a victory. It would be then that General Morgan would try to join General Washington there, who was camped across the Delaware River. And he would also to General John Nielsen, who at that time would run a detachment of New Jersey soldiers for almost close to almost a year. It was like 7 months from the fall of 1780 to almost the spring of 1781. And it would be at this time that Trent would provide this ferry service, also lumber, and make sure the soldiers got what they needed, even providing some supplies such as hogs and cattle. In addition to living there in South Trenton, he would also use this reputation with the Continental Ferry and such to, in 1780, join the New Jersey Assembly to hopefully use it as a platform to get back what he hopefully earned with the shelving of Vandalia, his precious, supposed colony with Benjamin Franklin, was still shelved and basically on the back burner till the end of the American Revolution. But unfortunately, by the end of the Revolution, Virginia would lay claim to most of the land that was known as Vandalia. And as he would eventually approach the Virginia Assembly, his health was worsening. He was having more relapses of his intermittent fever, and Vandalia would basically by 1782 be defeated, and it would be a struggle financially for William Trent. So at this point, as 1782 would reach, William Trent would have more relapses. He would actually be so severe that by 1782, after seeing Dr. William Shippen, not only a cousin of that Edward Shippen, the third, his master, Dr. William Shippen was also another shareholder in the Library Company of Philadelphia there, and he lived on 4th Street there. The house still resides there today. It was built around 1750. And it would be here that he would see Dr. William Shippen, and he would basically give him what was known then as Duke of Portland powder. Unfortunately, those who used that, and it would be later written in an article by Dr. Benjamin Rush, that not knowing at the time some of the ingredients to this such powder that was to cure not only gout and intermittent fever would eventually lead to be fatal. And this would be within 2 years. The deterioration of William Trent's life would basically happen because of this Portland powder and receiving such increments of medicine. He would almost spend 16 weeks making appointments and receiving this powder from Dr. William Shippen. But at this point, and financially being his health was in there, his home and plantation there in South Trenton would be in foreclosure. And as he would do that by 1784, would sell the house basically as is. It would be sold then by a clothier general, Bart de Klin, who would buy the house in basically the summer of 1784. And then it would be Trent sells is, him and his wife, Sarah, would eventually move to Philadelphia. And it's believed at that point they would be living currently either at the Indian Queen Tavern or on 4th Street of the Todd House. And I'll go into detail who that was. As you can see, this picture that just came up here, Trent would, after Dr. William Shippen visits toward the last sort of few months of his life there in the summer and fall of 1784, Trent would see basically a doctoress, a basically healer named Mary Waters. She would recommend some herbal remedies basically in his last few months of his life. And she would live on this Willing Alley where he would take what was known then as Sakona bark or Peruvian bark to view his ailments. But at this point, Trent was meeting his end. He would draft, by the summer, would draft his will of 1784. Now, this is the present day site. I mentioned the Todd House. This is basically 4th and Chestnut, where the John Todd, who was a schoolmaster not far from there, would be living. This is the present day site of that. And as I mentioned, John Todd and John Todd Jr., his son, were also shareholders in the Library Company of Philadelphia, just to show you some names. Unfortunately, at this time and with the deterioration of his health, like I said, he wrote his will on July 6, 1784. But by the winter, December the 1st, to be specific, 1784, Trent would basically, it would be announced in a letter, the only known existence of when he would pass away, mentioned in a letter from Thomas Clifford that said that he died on the 1st instant of December 1st, 1784. And it said that he died in basically of under dire financial circumstances, meaning he died penniless. And it's believed, at least based on the evidence, that he had no affiliation in church, at least in Philadelphia in his last few months. He was probably buried in what was known then as the Potter's Field, and basically Southeast Square, what it was known then, one of the original 5 squares of William Penn when he designed Philadelphia. Today, it's known as Washington Square Park. And this is a picture. The lower right-hand corner shows this would have been where majority, at least today, what's believed based on archaeological digs, it's close to over 10,000 people buried here. Continental soldiers, those enslaved, those that were in dire financial circumstances, just like Trent, that basically go today. And we visit actually Washington Square Park, you can actually see a statue of George Washington and basically a tomb of the unknown soldier at this time. And this, bringing up, I mentioned about, John Todd and John Todd Jr. John Todd Jr. was actually the actual librarian, the Library Company of Philadelphia during this time of when Trent passed away. And it would be here, this here would be a bundle of papers, and this would be written, what's believed in John Todd Jr.'s handwriting, of a bundle of papers that resided in William Trent's trunk after he died. Throughout his life, he mentioned a supposed infamous black trunk that he carried all his bundles of papers. And this is the inventory of it. Now, it may be hard to read, but some of the things that were on here would be bundles of papers, Indian transactions with the Indians at that time with George Washington in 1753 and 1754. He even had a copy of the Treaty of Lancaster as early as 1754 that were included in these bundles of papers. Now, a lot of this stuff is spread out throughout, at least either lost to history or in certain places like Philadelphia. But at least we know what was in that trunk when he died, and it was sort of like the only known really inventory when he would pass away there in December of 1784. And this is a copy of his will. And I mentioned about John Todd Jr. He would leave some shares and basically would become worthless. Shares in Vandalia in Indiana, those land shares that eventually, because of the Revolution, would become almost utterly worthless. when Virginia would lay claim to that area. And you can see arrows pointing to John Todd Jr. being mentioned in the will, as was down there. One of the witnesses as he signed his will was John Todd Sr., the schoolmaster. And the will itself was probably overlooked by John Todd Jr. because he was a acting attorney, or eventually became an acting attorney by 1785. It just finished law school. Eventually, John Todd Jr., if you're looking at that name, but eventually he was a Quaker, as was his father, a Quaker schoolmaster. John Todd Jr. would eventually basically marry a Quaker heiress named Dolly Payne there in 1790. Eventually, Dolly Payne would become Dolly Todd, but after John Todd Sr. and John Todd Jr. would die in the yellow fever outbreak in 1793, Dolly Todd would marry James Madison, and that would be Dolly Madison, the future, first lady there, with President James Madison later on in career, just for a fun fact there. So as we sort of wrap up here, the finishing thing here, miscellaneous, I mentioned about the clock he bought, still exists today at the Colonial Dames headquarters there in New Jersey, and just outside of Burlington, New Jersey. That's the picture of it, made by John Wood Sr. It's an extravagant clock. It's 8 feet tall, to give you an idea of size, and it's believed to be built. He had it built, or he bought it, purchased it probably in early 1750s when he was in Philadelphia. It was originally given to his daughter after he would pass away. Eventually, it would travel through to his great-granddaughter, there, Anna Rossell, who would eventually give it to one of her friends, Emily Warren Roebling. She was the wife of Washington Roebling and also the co-engineer of the Brooklyn Bridge. Emily Warren Roebling, thanks to her, was a member of the Colonial Dames and gifted it about a month or two before her death there in I believe it was 1905, to the Colonial Dames headquarters, where it still lies today. And we can thank her for that, for preserving such a great thing of history. Believe it or not, when Washington crossed the Delaware with General Nathaniel Greene, believe it or not, Nathaniel Greene would actually borrow a pocket telescope, or like a spyglass, from William Trent. And we know this because in 1780, William Trent would actually write to Nathaniel Greene saying, hey, my eyes aren't good what they used to be. I would like you to return that I gave to you 3 years earlier after they crossed the Delaware. And ironically, if you look at this statue here in Greenville, South Carolina, Nathaniel Greene is carrying a pocket telescope. So it has to wonder, humorously here, was this the same telescope that he never gave back to William Trent? So I always laugh when I see this picture doing this. As far as facts about his, John's only adult son that would live to adulthood would attend what was known then as the Trenton School Company on Academy Street, what's known today as Academy Street in Trenton. Then would take classes at the College of Physicians. That became the University of Pennsylvania Medical School. Became a doctor in Camden, South Carolina, where he's buried there in Old Presbyterian Cemetery in Camden, South Carolina. And as you can see, that's a picture of the Trenton Academy today on Academy Street. And eventually, Trent's daughter, Anne, his oldest daughter, would marry a Marbleheader that crossed the Delaware named Samuel Raymond. He was also eventually became a lifeguard, or sort of bodyguard for, Commander-in-Chief George Washington during the American Revolution. He would cross the Delaware, is probably where he met Anne Trent, and eventually would fight Trenton, Princeton, Brandywine. His records would actually, would be a tremendous service record. Eventually being, discharged there at Jockey Ridge at Morristown there. And they would live not far from Trenton until the, sort of the end of their lives. And that's sort of a picture there of the Washington and his troops finally reaching across the Delaware there. And then a fun fact with the library company. When the British occupied Philadelphia after Howe seized Philadelphia, it was believed, based on a record, that at the time a book was basically never returned by a Major Trent in 1778. This is the book here, The History of Greenland, or at least a copy of what the book looks like, not the exact book. And it was believed by Major Trent. Now, it's always believed, because it was in London, that it was returned. They believed it was a British officer, but in fact, it was actually would believe, based on the records and research that I did, it was probably believed to be this Major Trent, who became a major there in 1763, fighting at Fort Pitt. would be this Major Trent, because he would have able to go into the city, being that he was neither a loyalist nor a patriot at that time. Eventually, Trent would pose his loyalty and oath of allegiance to the patriot cause. But in 1778, it's believed then that it would be Trent that rented out this book and somehow got lost in the shuffle here and wasn't returned. At least it had been in London this whole time and it hadn't been returned until almost 1876. You can only imagine the day if you think about the library fees and overdue fines for somebody returning it almost 100 years later. Thank you all for attending tonight. Like I said, it was a great talk. It's always fun to tell and explain to people this life here of such a fascinating figure of William Trent.
Thank you so much for that, Jason. That was really, really interesting. What, like you said, what a fascinating guy. I too am a proud son of New Jersey, so I always like to see the Jersey boys do well for themselves. So everyone, you can submit your questions through the Q&A. We've got time to answer a couple. I'm curious what inspired your fondness for Trent. You clearly have a deep, deep passion for William Trent. Where did that come from?
So it basically started with our living history group. I mean, to this day, we still do the French-Indian War in our group. When we started, I was 10 years old when we started. So knowing, that our group was Captain William Trent's company, that group in 1754 that sort of tried to build the first English outpost there at the Forks of the Ohio, we know as Pittsburgh. Growing up as kids, I always wanted to know more. Like, who was William Trent? I had no idea when we joined, when my parents had us do this. And as we got older, it was like, I want to know more and more. And as I keep going, it's like, wow, how come not a lot is known about this? I mean, the last biography written on him was 1947. It was a small biography, and it sort of was groundbreaking because it sort of got the ball rolling, but there was so much stuff out there. And I think that's what inspired me to go. I think people needed, especially with the America's basically birth coming up here, 250 years, knowing of these background figures that basically all played a role in the history of America.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, in two summers, Philadelphia is going to be all the rage talking about all the characters. And I love all the library company connections. It seems like he was really in the orbit of the library company for a very long time. And one that you didn't mention was 1751, when he was at the Pennsylvania State House. The library company's connection was on the second floor at the time. That was prior to Carpenter's Hall. So you had another one. So let's dip into the Q&A here. So Robert Wong asks, two-parter. First is, where was the Continental Ferry, and was it ever used by the Continental Army prior to or after the first or second battles of Trenton? And then the second part, is there any correspondence or impressions by Washington or Trent about each other?
So, to answer the first question, the ferry itself, it's believed to be, I guess, the plantation itself, section of the land. I went back to that. I showed that sort of quick survey of what his land looked like. But basically, that land was sort of South Trenton. It was believed to be like a mile or two south of what would be known as downtown Trenton. But where Marine Terminal Park is today in South Trenton below, I believe the Trenton Thunder have a baseball stadium just above that. And there's a Marine Terminal Park where a lot of people do fishing. It's right on the Delaware River. It's believed it's just below Riverview Cemetery today, where like John Roebling is buried. It's a major cemetery in Trenton where a lot of Civil War even officers are buried. And just below that, Marine Terminal Park was believed where the ferry is based on the evidence. And it was, as far as prior to that, Elijah Bond, that was the previous owner, had advertisement for it as early as 1773. They didn't really offer, basically call it the Continental Ferry, basically till the American Revolution started. And it was right around the time that Trent would return then to Trenton is when he would sort of lease this off of Elijah Bond, who was living in the vicinity, but not necessarily on that property anymore. And that would be right there. So Trent would basically use that. And like I said, I mentioned Daniel Morgan, John Nielsen. It was also believed that some of the officers under Horatio Gates also crossed. But as far as for the first and second Battle of Trenton, there were so many ferries at the time. It's funny, even that is being as it's a lower ferry, and it would have been very, below that. Believe it or not, his older half brother, James Trent, patented a ferry as early as 1726. That would be in Ferry Street today in Trenton, New Jersey. And that would be that one. And then, of course, McConkey's that they took to cross into Trenton would be the one they took going back over they would use. And in fact, Trent would even miss it in 1781 when Washington's army heading to Yorktown would cross about 2 months before that. They decided to name the Continental Ferry back where Ferry Street was in Trenton, which was about 1.5 miles, 2 miles north of Trent's Ferry. And that became the official Continental Ferry. That injunction eventually changed, and Washington would use his entire army there in August of 1781 to cross there. So unfortunately, Trent just missed that. He didn't actually per se with George Washington, but he did, like I said, several of the officers and numerous ones that are mentioned, at least by letter, were crossing at the time. And as far as impressions of each other with George Washington and Trent, I know originally they sort of didn't really get along right away. Both were commissioned there in 1754. And Trent basically had the hard feelings towards Washington because at that time, at least in 1754, Trent had more military experience than George Washington. It's hard to believe when you think about it. But at that time, William Trent basically was basically mad at George Washington because they didn't get there in time. His men would eventually surrender the Forks of the Ohio to the French. And by the time Trent could hurry up Washington, who was delayed trying to even get men to come to Wills Creek there, what was present-day Cumberland, Maryland, the French had already taken over the Forks of the Ohio. And at that point, Washington wanted men to join him, and even Trent himself to join there, because they knew every path to and from the Forks of the Ohio. And Trent refused because Washington refused to pay him what he paid his men, which was 3 times more than what Virginia soldiers were getting. So there was a tryst then, but eventually, when Trent would sue Governor Dinwiddie for the basically reimbursement of this expedition, he would use George Washington as a character witness, believe it or not, and he'd actually win his suit over the governor by 1760, winning 800 pounds and using Washington as a witness. And eventually, they would become, Washington would seek his advice in 1758. They would fight together there at Ford's expedition, retaking the Forks of the Ohio. And then even a funnier thing, 1775, as George Washington eventually becomes commander-in-chief and heads to Cambridge, Trent writes Washington in the summer of 1775 and says, hey, remember those land dealings back in the 1750s? And I was inquiring about this certain land dealings and the money. And George Washington responded with, well, I can't know from record or from memory. Neither do I have the papers with me. And in unknown certain terms was pretty much saying, William, I'm trying to start an army here and win the revolution. I can't worry about land dealings from our French and Indian War days. So they eventually, like I said, by the late 1750s, pretty much rekindled any type of and became, basically mutual friends. They would, there would be a few things, but never had any ill will after 1754.
How much regret do you think he had about Vandalia not coming to be? And it seems like the revolution really kind of threw a wrench in that.
And it was a matter of timing. It was a basic thing. I mean, his land deals were great, then the French Indian War breaks out. And then when he thinks he's getting stuff back, they retake the Ohio Valley, Fort Pitt's being built. He can open up the largest mercantile store. His best customers are the local nations, the natives. And then that hostilities break out with certain members in Indian nations there in 1763. And now all his best customers won't touch any of that. And in addition, he never got any paid because he gave them lines of credit instead of actually paying money. So he never got any money back from that store and became a financial failure due to that late Indian War. So by combining all those debts at one point, by the time Treaty of Stanwix broke out, Trent owned at least what it was believed in modern day money, almost millions he owed at that time. So I think he definitely regretted it because of Vandalia was definitely the opportunity. It was something that was accomplished by what has been known, at least at that time in 1773, before the outbreak, no American had ever accomplished before. Him and Franklin were basically on top of the world when that got approved, and basically, but then it got shelved and everything went. And you figure he spent from 1754 to his death in 1784 trying to get money for 30 years, and he ended up dying penniless because of it.
Rough turn there.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's all we've got time for this evening. Thank you again for this. It was
thank you.
Thanks to the audience out there. Hope you all enjoyed yourself this evening. There will be a follow-up email with a recording there will be a recording sent out to all everyone who attended and registered for tonight's event, and we hope to see you in the future at some more library company public programs. Have a good night, everyone.